She whispered, "My boy can't breathe." Then he found the poison in the mine. The air in Black Gulch tasted of metal and ash. Dust from the ore crusher clung to everything, coating the crooked rooftops and weary faces in a film of rust-colored gray. The stamper mill's drone was relentless, the sick heartbeat of a town eating itself alive for a few glittering specks of gold. Alistair Finch no longer heard it. He sat in his squalid room, the only sound that registered the swish of whiskey in a dirt-streaked glass. The old smell of antiseptic and the sour tang of regret mingled into the air he breathed. Then came a knock. Not the heavy-handed rap of a drunken miner, but a hesitant, almost desperate tap. He ignored it. The knock came again, more persistent. With a guttural curse, Alistair staggered to the door. The woman stood there, Inga, the cursed one, the town called her. Tall, thin, her blue eyes now hollowed out by exhaustion. She was holding a small boy wrapped in a thin blanket. The boy wasn't crying. He was only breathing each inhale a shallow, rattling gasp. A strange blue-gray line traced his lips. Silence. That blue-gray color. Alistair had seen it once before in a fine Boston room just before his world had collapsed. The tremor in his hands wasn't entirely from the whiskey. Inga looked at him, not pleading, just a grim acceptance in her gaze. Alistair stepped back, leaving the door open. "Fine," he muttered. "Bring him in. But I don't work miracles." The air in Black Gulch tasted of metal and ash. Dust from the ore crusher clung to everything, coating the crooked rooftops and weary faces in a film of rust-colored gray. The stamper mill's drone was relentless, the sick heartbeat of a town eating itself alive for a few glittering specks of gold. Alistair Finch no longer heard it. He sat in his squalid room, the only sound that registered the swish of whiskey in a dirt-streaked glass. The old smell of antiseptic and the sour tang of regret had mingled into the very air he breathed. Then came a knock. Not the heavy-handed rap of a drunken miner, but a hesitant, almost desperate tap. He ignored it. The knock came again, more persistent. With a guttural curse, Alistair staggered to the door, pulling it open with a groan of warped wood. "Whatever they're selling, I'm not buying," he slurred. The woman stood there, Inga. The cursed one, the town called her. She didn't flinch at his tone. "He is sick, doctor." The title hit him like a physical blow. "I'm no doctor." He snapped the words sharp with self-loathing. "Not anymore. Go see the healer down the street. I hear he works wonders with smoked herbs and nonsense." "He says it is a curse," Inga replied, her voice steady, her blue eyes piercing the gloom of his drunkenness. "I do not believe in curses. I believe it is something else." For a long moment he just stared at her, this pillar of exhausted defiance on his doorstep. He saw the abyss in her eyes and recognized it as a reflection of his own. With a sigh that seemed to drain the last of his fight, he stepped back, leaving the door open. "Fine, bring him in. But I don't work miracles." She moved past him, a ghost of quiet dignity in the squalor of his life, and gently laid the small boy on the lumpy, stained cot. The child wasn't crying. He was only breathing each inhale a shallow, rattling gasp. A strange blue-gray line traced his lips. "His name is Lars," she said softly. Alistair approached his own hands, trembling. He forced them still, the old professional discipline, a phantom limb twitching to life. He knelt his fingers, once so skilled, now clumsy as they felt for the boy's thready pulse. "How long?" "2 days. Like the others. But faster." He lifted one of the boy's eyelids. The pupil was a pinprick, and that color around the mouth, that pale blue-gray stain of death seeping into life. Silence. He knew that color. It threw him back in time. A Boston parlor, the scent of lilac water, not rot-gut whiskey. A young woman on a silk chaise lounge, her breath just as shallow, and his own voice so sure, so fatally wrong, echoing in the chambers of his memory, a simple female malady, madam. Nothing a bit of rest won't cure. He recoiled from the cot as if struck the memory of physical force. The tremor returned to his hands, violent and uncontrollable. This wasn't just a sick child. This was a ghost. This was judgment. Inga watched him, her expression unreadable. "What is it? What do you see?" Alistair stood, turning his back to her, to the boy, to the accusation on the cot. He walked to his small, grimy window and stared out at the gray dust of Black Gulch. The doctor in him, the man he had tried to drown for years, was clawing its way to the surface. He wasn't being asked to be a hero. He was being asked to face the one failure he could never outrun. His voice, when it came, was different. The slur was gone, replaced by a low, raw intensity. "Where do you get your water?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. "The creek," Inga answered, her voice cautious. "The one that runs behind the shacks." "Downstream from the mine," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. He turned from the window, his eyes now holding a terrifying clarity. He strode to a dusty leather bag in the corner, a relic from another life, and unbuckled the straps. His hands were steady now, moving with a cold, forgotten purpose. Inga whispered, "Can you help him?" Alistair paused, his back still to her, a small glass vial in his hand. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't offer hope. "I don't know," he said, his voice the sound of grinding stone. "But I know this is no curse." The word hung in the air between them, a declaration of war against the town's suffocating ignorance. For a moment the room was just the rasp of the boy's breathing and the frantic pounding in Alistair's own chest. The whiskey haze had burned away, leaving behind the cold, terrifying clarity of purpose. He was a doctor again, whether he wanted the title or not. "Water," he commanded, his voice devoid of its earlier slur. "Boil it. Keep it hot." Inga moved without a word, a shadow of swift efficiency. She stoked the small pot-bellied stove, her movements economical and sure. She did not ask what for. She did not question. She had brought her son to this broken man, and in his eyes she had seen something shift. The drunkard had retreated, and something older, something fiercely intelligent, had taken his place. Alistair worked his hands now, moving with a grim precision he thought he had lost forever. He crushed a piece of dried charcoal from the hearth with the butt of his empty whiskey bottle, grinding it into a fine black powder. He mixed it with a little water, creating a dark, gritty slurry. It was a crude, desperate remedy, an attempt to absorb the poison he knew was lining the boy's gut. "Hold his head," he said. Inga cradled her son, her face a mask of stone. Alistair gently pried the boy's lips open, that terrible blue-gray line searing itself into his mind, and tipped the mixture in, forcing the small throat to swallow. Lars choked weakly, but the black liquid went down. Alistair stood, wiping the grit from his fingers. It wasn't enough. A diagnosis made in a liquor-fueled haze was one thing. Proof was another. He needed to be sure. He needed to see the source of the rot. "Keep him warm," he told Inga, his eyes locking with hers. "Don't let anyone in." He strode out into the oppressive gray of Black Gulch. The town felt different now. The constant rhythmic pounding of the stamper mill was no longer just a noise. It was the sound of a slow, methodical murder. The dust wasn't just dirt. It was the residue of greed settling on the souls of the people who lived and died here. He followed the path behind the row of miners' shacks to the creek. The water ran deceptively clear over smooth stones, but Alistair's newly sober eyes saw what others missed. There was no life here. No water striders dancing on the surface, no minnows darting in the shallows. The creek bed was coated in a fine, almost invisible layer of gray silt. He followed it upstream until he found it a wide iron pipe jutting from the hillside like a weeping wound, disgorging a steady trickle of discolored water from the mine's tailings pond directly into the creek. He uncorked a small glass bottle from his pocket and scooped a sample, the gray silt swirling within it like a captured storm. This was it, the town's lifeblood and its poison. On his way back, a figure blocked his path. Silas Croft, the town's self-proclaimed healer, his face puffy with false piety and his clothes smelling of burnt sage. "You've been with the cursed woman." Croft sneered, his eyes flicking to the bottle in Alistair's hand. "The sickness is in her blood. You meddle with things you don't understand, Finch. You'll bring her filth upon us all." Alistair stopped holding the bottle up to the pale light. "The only filth in this town, Croft, is the lies you sell, and whatever is in this water." Croft's face darkened. "That is God's water. The boy is afflicted by sin, hers and now yours for consorting with her. God has nothing to do with this." Alistair said, his voice dangerously low. "This is the work of men. Greedy men. Careless men." He pushed past the healer without another glance, leaving the man sputtering in his wake. Back in the room, the tense silence was a living thing. He administered more of the charcoal mixture, then sat on a rickety stool, watching, waiting. Every shallow breath the boy took was a measure of Alistair's own damnation or salvation. He wasn't thinking of being a hero. He was in a fine Boston parlor watching a young woman fade away, listening to his own confident, ignorant assurances. He was taking her pulse, feeling it weaken under his touch, and doing nothing. Now he was doing something. He was fighting. Not for the boy, not really. Not for Inga. He was fighting the ghost in that Boston room. Hours bled into one another. The lamp burned low. Inga sat perfectly still, a silent statue of maternal terror and trust. Then a change, a single, deeper breath from the cot. The rattling in the boy's chest seemed to quiet for a moment. Alistair leaned forward, his own heart seizing. He pressed his fingers to the boy's neck. The pulse was still a flutter, a trapped bird's wing, but it was there. It was steady, a flicker of something that felt dangerously like hope ignited in his chest. At that exact moment, a heavy shadow fell across the room's only window, blotting out the fading light. A thick-set man in a bowler hat stood outside the door, his shape a promise of violence. He didn't knock. The heavy silence left in the enforcer's wake was colder than the mountain wind that seeped through the cracks in the walls. Mr. Shanklin had not raised his voice, had not made a single overt threat. Yet the room felt violated, the air thick with the promise of corporate violence. On the scarred wooden table, the small pouch of coins sat like a coiled snake. It was a simple, brutal equation, his life for the boys. A fair trade, the whiskey-soaked part of his mind whispered. A quiet exit. An end to this fight before it truly began. Alistair looked from the money to the cot where Lars lay, a fragile vessel of life against the grim tide of poison. He saw Inga, her back ramrod straight, her gaze fixed on her son, refusing to acknowledge the bribe that sealed their fate. She was not looking at him, not pressuring him. She was simply enduring a testament of silent, unbreakable will that more than anything shamed him. The ghost in the Boston parlor screamed at him to run, to take the money, to find a new town, a new bottle, a new oblivion. He pushed the thought away with a physical shudder. "He wants me gone." Alistair stated the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. Inga's gaze finally shifted to him, her eyes clear and deep as a fjord, held no plea, only a question. "Will you go?" He looked at the boy, at the faint blue-gray line that was the signature of his own past failure. He had run once. He had spent years running. The landscape had changed, but the ghost had always kept pace. He met her eyes, and for the first time in a decade, he stood his ground. No. A decision made. A line drawn in the dust of his squalid life. But a decision was not a cure. The charcoal was a feeble dam against a rising river. He needed to neutralize the poison at its source. Lead. The word itself was heavy, inert, a dead thing that killed slowly. He knew from dusty textbooks read in a life he barely recognized as his own that certain compounds could bind to it, could draw it from the body. He needed sulfur. He needed calcium salts. Chemicals. the building blocks of a miracle he had told her he couldn't work. "I need things," he said, the mind of the physician clicking into place, assessing inventory, forming a strategy. "From the general store. Stay with him. Keep him warm." The Black Gulch Mercantile was a cave of shadows and scents, ground coffee-oiled leather, cured tobacco, and the cloying sweetness of licorice sticks in a jar on the counter. Henderson, the proprietor, was a man whose spine was made of shifting sand bending to the prevailing wind. And the wind in Black Gulch blew from the Corbin mine. Henderson was polishing the counter with a rag, his eyes fixed on the wood grain. "Finch," he said, his voice flat. He didn't look up. "Henderson," Alistair returned, his tone even. "I need supplies, a few chemical reagents, for an assay." The rag stopped moving. "Can't help you. You carry sulfur for the prospectors and calcium chloride for the ice in winter. I've seen them." Henderson finally looked up, his face a mask of practiced neutrality, but his eyes were filled with a skittish fear. "Stock's out," he said. "Wagon's late. I saw a barrel of sulfur in the back room not 3 days ago." Alistair pressed, his voice hardening. "I said," Henderson repeated, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "I'm out. Mr. Corbin is the only reason this town has a pulse. He signs my ledger. He doesn't like complications. Now, unless you're buying a bottle, I suggest you leave. I have a family to consider." The dismissal was absolute. The door of the mercantile shut behind Alistair, but it felt as if the entire town had just slammed its doors in his face. He was an outcast, and she was the cursed one. Together, they were a contagion the town was determined to isolate. He walked back through the muddy street, the weight of his failure a physical thing. He had no antidote. He had no allies. He had only a dying child, a grief-stricken mother, and the ghost of his own incompetence for company. He slumped into the chair in his room, the brief surge of purpose draining out of him, leaving a familiar hollow ache. The half-empty whiskey bottle lay on the floor by his feet, a silent, seductive promise of release. Just one drink. To steady his nerves, to dull the edges of his regret. His hand twitched, wanting to reach for it. Then he felt a presence beside him. Inga stood there. She said nothing. She simply took a clean cloth, dipped it in the basin of hot water, and wrung it out. She placed the steaming cloth on the table before him, next to a chipped cup of what smelled like weak bitterroot tea. A small, simple act of care. It was not pity. It was not forgiveness. It was something far more powerful. It was solidarity. She sat in the other chair, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze returning to her son. A shared, silent vigil in the heart of a hostile world. The silence stretched, filled only by the boy's labored breathing and the distant, mocking heartbeat of the mine. "Why," Alistair's voice was a rough, broken thing. "Why come to me? Everyone in this town knows what I am." Inga didn't look at him. She watched the slight rise and fall of her son's chest under the thin blanket. A long minute passed before she spoke, her voice low and steady. "My husband," she began. "He was a carpenter. He built things from nothing. He used to say you can judge the quality of a man by the tools he keeps, even if he no longer uses them." Her gaze flickered for a fraction of a second to the dusty, worn leather medical bag in the corner. "I saw your tools, doctor." The word this time did not sting. It landed like a thrown gauntlet. A challenge. An impossible article of faith. It was a faith he had lost in himself, but one this woman was now offering him, a single flickering candle in the crushing darkness of his past. A new resolve, cold and hard as steel, settled in his soul. If the town would not give him the tools to fight, he would take them. He was done running. He was done being the town drunk. He stood up, the chair scraping against the floorboards. He looked at the pouch of coins Shanklin had left glinting dully in the lamplight. A coward's wage. He looked at Inga, her face etched with a strength he could only dream of possessing. He looked at Lars. He grabbed his worn, threadbare coat. "Stay with him. Lock the door after me." He paused his hand on the latch. "Don't open it for anyone." "Where are you going?" Inga asked, her voice tight with a new kind of fear. Alistair looked back, his face a mask of grim determination. "Henderson is out of sulfur," he said, his voice flat and hard as iron. "I'm going to the source." The night had swallowed Black Gulch, leaving only the skeletal outlines of the rooftops against a bruised sky. The relentless, grinding heartbeat of the stamper mill was a physical presence as Alistair moved through the shadows, a ghost haunted by a new and terrifying purpose. The whiskey tremors were gone, burned away by the cold fire of adrenaline. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man running directly into the heart of a new and present hell. His target was the assay office, its single lamp, a lone, jaundiced eye in the overwhelming dark. It was a temple of science perverted in the service of greed. Hiding behind a colossal slag heap, he watched the single guard make his slow, predictable rounds. Once the man's footsteps faded, Alistair acted. He located a small coal chute on the far side of the building, its iron doors secured by a simple rusted pin. It groaned in protest, but gave way, and he lowered himself into the darkness, landing in a pile of coal dust. He slipped from the storage closet into the main office. The air smelled of chemicals and scorched metal. Jars of powders and liquids lined the shelves, meticulously labeled. He moved quickly, his hands grabbing a small sack of sulfur flour and a jar of calcium salts. As he turned to leave, his eyes caught on a heavy leather-bound ledger left open on the desk. He hesitated for only a second before leaning over it. His eyes scanned the spidery script. October 1888, tailings pond maintenance, $50. November 1888, chemical leak contained, $15. Then an entry that made the blood freeze in his veins. December 1888, condolence payment to the family of Eric Johansson, immigrant laborer. Cause of death, lung fever. Expense, $25. Eric Johansson, Inga's brother-in-law, the first of the cursed. It wasn't negligence, it was a cover-up. Corbin knew. He had weighed the cost of fixing the leak against the cost of a few immigrant lives and had found their lives wanting. The quiet anger in Alistair's gut erupted into a white-hot rage. He clutched the chemicals and turned only to find the main office door swinging silently open. Mr. Shanklin stood silhouetted in the doorway, a lantern held high. He was not surprised. He had been waiting. Looking for something, Dr. Shanklin's voice was smooth as polished riverstone. He stepped into the room, letting the door click shut behind him. The sound was as final as a cell door locking. Alistair stood his ground, nodding toward the open ledger. Proof. Shanklin's gaze followed his. Proof is a dangerous thing, he said, setting his lantern on a table. It has a habit of disappearing, along with the people who find it. He began to slowly, deliberately take off his coat. Mr. Corbin believes in tying up loose ends. He paid you to leave, Doctor. Your refusal was fiscally irresponsible. He lunged. Alistair was no fighter, and he dodged sideways, stumbling against a workbench. As Shanklin moved in again, Alistair's desperate eyes scanned the shelves. His hand shot out, grabbing a tin canister labeled magnesium powder. As Shanklin swung a blow meant to end the fight, Alistair ducked under it and flung the contents of the canister directly into the flame of the lantern. The world dissolved in a silent, blinding explosion of white light. Shanklin roared in shocked, blinded rage, stumbling backward, his hands flying to his scorched eyes. It was the only chance Alistair would get. He grabbed the sulfur and salts and bolted for the coal chute. He scrambled out into the night just as he heard Shanklin crashing around the office behind him. He ran into the darkness, but his foot caught on a loose cable, sending him sprawling. Pain, sharp and electric, shot up his leg from his ankle. He pushed himself up, his breath coming in ragged sobs, and forced himself to keep going, dragging his now useless leg behind him. The journey back to his room was an eternity of pain. He was bleeding, covered in grime, but he clutched the chemicals to his chest like sacred relics. He finally reached his own door and gave the soft, prearranged knock. Inga threw it open, her face a pale oval in the dim light. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as she took in his condition. "You are hurt," she whispered, reaching for him. He stumbled past her, kicking the door shut and sliding the bolt home. He ignored the fire in his ankle and the throbbing in his shoulder. He lurched to the table and laid down the stolen chemicals. "Later," he rasped, waving away her concern. "First, we fight back." He began to work, measuring and mixing with frantic, feverish energy, running on nothing but adrenaline and the ghost of a long-dead oath. He prepared the new, more potent antidote, a solution that held the weight of his entire life. His failure, his rage, his last desperate gamble. He drew it into a glass syringe and knelt by the cot one more time, administering the injection to the still small form of Lars. Then they waited. The silence in the room was absolute. The boy's small body suddenly arched a single, violent convulsion. Inga cried out a strangled sound of terror. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. Lars fell back against the lumpy mattress limp. For a horrifying second, Alistair thought he had failed again. But then he saw it. A faint, fragile blush of color returned to the boy's cheeks, a tiny sunrise pushing back against the encroaching twilight of the blue-gray line on his lips. It was a sign. A real, tangible sign. Hope, terrifying and brilliant, flooded Alistair's exhausted soul. He looked up at Inga, a ragged, triumphant smile starting to form on his lips. That's when he heard it. The heavy, deliberate crunch of multiple boots on the gravel outside his door. Not one man this time. 3, 4. And then the sharp, unmistakable metallic click of a rifle's hammer being pulled back. The fragile moment of hope shattered into 1,000 pieces with the sharp, metallic click from the world outside. It was the sound of a conclusion being reached, a final lethal sentence. Alistair's ragged smile died on his lips. The surge of triumph was instantly replaced by a wash of cold, clear adrenaline. The fight for Lars's life had been won for now. The fight for all their lives was just beginning. He moved his injured ankle, screaming in protest, but his actions were swift and precise. "Get down," he hissed to Inga, his voice a low command. "Away from the window." He shoved his heaviest piece of furniture, a lopsided chest of drawers, against the flimsy door. It wouldn't hold for long, but it would buy them seconds. He blew out the oil lamp, plunging the room into a deep gloom, lit only by the faint hellish orange glow from the grate of the pot-bellied stove. Outside, the heavy boots shuffled, surrounding the small shack, cutting off the world. Then came the voice, smooth and confident, slicing through the night. "Shanklin. Finch. We know you're in there. Mr. Corbin is a forgiving man. Open the door. Return what isn't yours, and we can all forget this unfortunate evening ever happened. Lies. All of it." Alistair looked at the faint outline of Inga, who had dragged the cot with Lars on it into the far corner, shielding her son with her own body. He knew that opening the door meant a quick bullet for him and a silent, convenient disappearance for the only 2 witnesses to the truth of the town's curse. "What will we do?" Inga's whisper was a ghost of sound in the tense darkness. Alistair's mind raced, cataloging the pathetic contents of his room not as a home, but as a battlefield. A rickety table, a lumpy cot, a few empty bottles, and on the table the stolen chemicals. His gaze fell upon the stove, its black pipe rising up through the ceiling. An escape route, something else. "They expect us to wait," he whispered back, his mind seizing on a desperate, insane idea. "Or to surrender. We won't do either." Shanklin's voice came again, the patience wearing thin. "Last chance, Doctor, don't make this a public spectacle. The town doesn't need to see this." A spectacle. The word ignited a spark in Alistair's mind. That was exactly what he needed. He couldn't win a fight against 4 armed men. But he wasn't a fighter. He was a chemist. He limped back to the table, his hands finding the small remaining pile of magnesium powder. He added a pinch of the sulfur flour, mixing the fine powders together on a scrap of paper. It was a volatile, unpredictable combination. A fool's gambit. He turned to Inga, his face a grim shadow in the stove's faint light. "I'm going to make a great deal of noise and light. When I tell you cover Lars, cover his face and yours, and do not look up, no matter what you hear." She simply nodded, her eyes wide but trusting. She understood this was the language of desperation. "Now," he commanded. He took the small packet of volatile powder, crossed the room in 2 painful strides, and wrenched open the iron door of the stove. The heat washed over his face. Without a second's hesitation, he tossed the packet directly onto the glowing red coals. He slammed the door shut just as the contents ignited. There was no loud explosion. Instead, a deep, guttural whoosh came from within the stove, a sound like a giant beast inhaling. The iron structure groaned and shuddered on its legs. A low roar began to build inside the chimney pipe, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards. Outside, the shuffling boots fell silent. Shanklin and his men, hearing the strange escalating noise, paused in confusion. Inside the shack, Alistair and Inga were crouched in the corner waiting for the result of his gambit. The roar from the chimney grew louder, angrier, building towards a furious, unknown crescendo. He wasn't trying to blow the shack apart. He was sending up a signal, a pillar of fire, a spectacle for the entire sleeping town of Black Gulch to see. The stove shuddered, and then the world outside the single grimy window erupted in a silent, impossible bloom of light. A geyser of brilliant white magnesium fire roared up from the chimney, a pillar of incandescent fury that tore a hole in the night and painted the clouds in searing silver. It was a signal flare from hell itself, beautiful and terrifying. Alistair watched through a crack in the door as the sleeping town of Black Gulch was shocked awake. Distant shouts echoed. Doors creaked open. Yellow squares of lamplight began to speckle the darkness. His spectacle, it was working. Shanklin and his men were caught frozen for a fatal second between their dark purpose and the sudden unwanted glare of public attention. "He set the shack on fire." Shanklin's voice boomed, a desperate attempt to control the narrative. "The drunk's gone mad." But Alistair answered, his own voice clear and sober, shouting through the wood of the door so it carried across the now gathering crowd. "There is no fire. There is poison in your water. Corbin's mine is poisoning your children." He pressed the glass bottle of Silty Creek water against the window pane, the sample illuminated by the dying, unholy glow from his chimney. "Here is the proof. Ask yourselves how many of your own have died of the lung fever." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. They saw the armed men. They saw the doctor, a man they knew as a drunk, now a defiant voice in the night. They saw the bottle held up like a sacrament. And they remembered. They remembered their own lost friends, their own sick children, their own unspoken fears. Doubt, a far more potent poison than Corbin's lies, began to seep into the crowd. Shanklin saw it in their faces. He had lost control. A public gunfight to silence a doctor accusing the mine of murder was a fire he could not put out. With a low, vicious curse, he gave a sharp, angry signal. He and his men retreated, melting back into the shadows from which they came, their threats left unspoken. The siege was broken. As the pre-dawn light began to soften the edges of the world, Alistair finally unbarred the door. The air was cold and clean. He turned back to the room. Inga was kneeling by the cot. Lars was sleeping peacefully, his breath now a deep and even rhythm. The terrible blue-gray line around his lips was gone, replaced by the healthy pink of a living child. Inga looked up at Alistair, her eyes, once hollowed by fear, now held a quiet, immeasurable gratitude. "The curse," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. It is broken." Alistair looked down at his own hands. They were scraped and bruised, but for the first time in years they were steady. He gazed out at the waking town at the promise of the rising sun. "There was never a curse, Inga," he said, his voice low and weary but finally clear. "Only a sickness. But I think the fever is finally breaking." The haze of poisoned water may have cleared from Black Gulch Creek, but the tale of reluctant hero Alistair Finch and fearless mother Inga still ripples through every canyon, proof that truth, no matter how deeply buried in steel and silence, can ignite into blazing justice. They turned a curse into a beacon, and silence into the roar of hope, saving a life that seemed already lost. If that final stand left your heart racing, tap like to spread their courage and share this story with anyone hungry for tales of unexpected heroes rising against cruelty. Next week, wind-blasted Whispering Gulch will tremble as an aging soldier returns to face the phantoms of his own past and a debt that even death itself won't forgive. Prepare for a journey into guilt, redemption, and the voices that refuse to be forgotten. Subscribe now and ring the bell so you don't miss a single footstep down those shadowed trails. Out here, beyond gun smoke and grit, it's the echoes of regret that can be deadliest.